Today on Substance Stories, we're going to be talking about therapeutic boundaries and their importance in recovery. Nathan, I was hoping today we would talk about the therapeutic boundary. I was talking to a colleague the other day that called it the therapeutic no, and why that's so important. So I think one of my least pleasant parts of my job is when I have to say no to a patient of mine, or I have to say, look, I don't think this is the current time for you to be in this detox or rehab unit, and we need to make a plan that doesn't include you staying here for now. Why do you think that sort of scenario is important for the therapeutic relationship?
I think on a number of levels, I think it promotes honesty. It promotes that you're willing to have a difficult conversation. And, you know, it's not easy to say no and kick people out, like you said, but it shows you're willing to work through that and put your own comfortability second, and put their needs first. And often that is having a difficult conversation.
Yeah, there's a great phrase in psychiatry, or it's actually in neurology from another part of psychiatry they're working called F&D, where they say, don't be weird, which is what I've taken to mean is if you're thinking something, you've got to be able to bring that into the conversation with someone. And you can't, and I remember as a trainee a lot, I would leave a room with a consultant psychiatrist, and they would say to me, oh, this is what's going on with that patient. And I thought to myself, well, that's a bizarre thing to not say in the room with the patient. Why would we hold on to that information? We should be telling that person. So I think honesty is absolutely key. How can we? I always say to my patients, we're doing this together. I can tell you what I think the evidence says and what I think is the best thing to do in this situation, but you're the one who has to walk. It's your brain, it's your life. We have to be making decisions together. I can't make decisions for you. So I think honesty is really important. But I also think, and I think we've talked about this before with addiction. Addiction is constantly a boundary violator. If I have an addiction, the role, the illness is I'm going to do whatever I can do to continue that addiction. I'm going to lie, cheat, steal to get that drug because that is exactly what the illness is doing. It's affecting my decision making my decision making abilities. So part of recovery to me is relearning where the boundaries are. Is resetting that honesty. And I think to me, it's one of the things I actually um, stands out to me is when I talk to people in recovery is how remarkably honest they are, how very good they are at disclosing and not being weird, I guess, in that situation. Say, hey, this is what I'm feeling now. This is what that felt. These are my worries about this. And I think part of that is saying, okay, well, you've drunk in this scenario, or you've broken the rules in this scenario, so we're going to have to have a boundary around that, and there will be a consequence to that. Is that something that sort of rings true to you about the recovery process?
Of course, I think it breeds true about learning anything in life. When we're children and we're growing up and becoming teenagers, like a normal part of growing up is pushing boundaries. You kind of see what you can get away with, and then a parent or some other figure you might look up to, a role model, will be like, okay, this is a bit too far. I'm going to set a limit here. And limit setting is a normal part of a need of any human being growing up. And re-engaging in life again, clean and sober, um, you need people to set limits. It's like, okay, I've gone a bit too far here. I need someone to say, that's not okay. And then I learn, I reflect. And if you don't, what are you teaching that person? You're teaching them, I can do the same thing over and over. And my psychiatrist or my psychologist, my therapist saying, oh, that doesn't breach any violation of our relationship. Therefore, that must be okay. Because if it wasn't okay, this professional would tell me, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think with the child and with the professional relationship, a parent that cares enforces a boundary, right? A parent that doesn't care says, do whatever you want. And that's actually terrifying for a child, and I think in that therapeutic diet, a therapist that cares and said, no, this is the boundary here, that's comforting, right? That's helping us reset our attachment to, reality, life, society. When you exit, sorry, go.
I was just
No, no.
with that as well. I think one of the biggest things that I see, especially working with young people, which often have a range of attachment issues, or people that, you know, present with, personality disorders and stuff like that, is consistency is super important, like that relational pattern, like what they might bring out of us, this desire to really care for them. We might have we get sucked into this push pull of wanting to really care for the patient or the client.
Mm.
And then we feel like we might even cross our own boundaries for the sake of like what's best for the client. Maybe keep them in the rehab even though they've broken this rule. But what we're doing when we're inconsistent with those boundaries is, creating this unsafe environment for them because then they feel anxious about what they can do and not do. And for me, the most important thing working with clients and patients here, especially young people, is consistent boundaries. So they feel know what they can do and what's not okay in a relationship.
Yeah, big time. And I guess we until now we've talked about the enforcing but I see, as you say, that inconsistently goes two ways, and I see often, uh, yeah, if depending on how the clinicians or the ward staff feel towards you, their counter transference, how they're thinking about you, whether they like you or not, they'll be, the boundaries will be inconsistently applied, and that itself, I think, is really confusing and awful for a client going through rehab as well. It's awful. Why is this person not having the rules applied to them, and this person wasn't? What does that say about the fairness of this organisation? How it is, what does it say about my recovery that there are different rules? It's something that I really try and stamp out wherever I work. Have When you've had to exit someone from a facility before, Nathan, tell us about that experience.
There's been a range of times, I suppose like certain places I've worked, I'm just kind of reflecting on certain places I've worked over many years where we work with kind of young people, and we'll bring people in that are might not have stable accommodation. They come in from homelessness, right?
Yeah,
Um, and when people come in, they agree to an exit plan, right? So if they need to get exited, this is their exit plan. And for people that are often homeless, they'll be dropping them off to a crisis accommodation organization. So you're pretty much exiting them back into homelessness. Um,
yeah,
and when you're doing that to someone that's highly vulnerable, um, that can be really can bring up a lot of stuff.
awful.
So for me, what I find is, you might say, look, this has happened, and we might need to, you're going to have to go for that. Often people will start bringing up, yeah, but I'm homeless, or I'm this, or
Yeah,
all these kind of things to try and stay. And you know, I like to think a lot of us, most of us in the field, are very compassionate people and quite
yeah,
empathetic, and that can make you starting to want to kind of break your own boundaries and, like,
yeah,
maybe want to keep them here and save them. But, I kind of really reflect on what's most needed for this young person or this patient or this client. And that often is consistency. It's you've broken this rule. You've come into this organization, you come into our service and you've committed to these sets of expectations and values and to adopt
yeah,
these values. And there's been a kind of a certain breach and we need to exit you, and being really kind of compassionate in that of this is why.
yeah,
And we don't judge you as a person or anything like that. It's just this behavior has
yeah,
happened and there's a consequence for that. However, we'd love for you to reapply, or we'd love for you to put another
yeah,
referral in because we do really care about you. And what do you need now that you need to go? What can we do to support you in this exit? Um,
yeah,
for me, the
yeah,
main thing with that is showing I don't judge you as a person. There's this behavior,
yeah,
and we
yeah,
need to hold you accountable for that. Because every action has a consequence, whether it's a positive or a negative consequence. Um, and that doesn't have any implications on how I view you as a person. I still really care about you. And that's why I'm doing
yeah,
what I do care. And I'd love to see you come back.
yeah. I think in my mind, I mean, if started that scenario you described is heartbreaking, and something that I've experienced myself as well, and it is a truly terrible part of the job. I think to me there are two sort of times that I have to discharge someone in an unplanned manner, or maybe in a way that I find hard. One is in that scenario that you described, perhaps where they've done the program, they're really there's no more that they could achieve from staying, so it is time to go, but there is that fear around leaving, right? Because it's obviously way easier to remain sober when you're in a facility and you've got this structure and the support network around you, and we all go and have less support network around us in the community. So there's that unwillingness to go despite there being nothing more to do. And I think I just have that conversation about how this is the next step. It might bring with us, there are challenges, and it might bring with us failure, but, that's part of the journey, and the road to recovery is paved with relapses, and, and we learn from each one. And then the other one is as you say, when there's been a boundary violation, like when someone perhaps has used drugs or obtained drugs on the ward. And I think, again, there's that, exactly as you say. This is not, a judgment on you. This is a continuing part of the illness, and it doesn't change. My fondness or affection towards you, or perhaps a better way of phrasing it, is our relationship, because our relationship is based around you having an addiction and me treating that addiction. So of course you're going to use substances. That's part of it, but it does mean you can't continue staying now. And one thing I really like, in my current job that I didn't previously have, is more ownership over that. So I think in the public system, it is very much, as you sort of say, please apply again. But the bureaucracy, and, it's not as simple to just say, please apply again, because then they have to go through the intake again and all that. What I really like with how I'm working now is I call everyone up the day after they leave, or a colleague does, and says, what is our plan? How do we get you back? Or if it's not to us, how are we going to get you sober? And so it's that shift, and I think in a private sector where we're less burdened by the bureaucracy, we can be a bit more. We can change that percentage from maybe 90%, 10%, 90% patient's effort, 10% service, to maybe like 85-15, which I think is really helpful.
Exactly. And through that, I think, it's showing that this relationship is ongoing. It's easy for me necessarily to say you can reapply and stuff, then they might not see me till they come back. However, with what you're saying, the power of that is you're showing you're modeling what an actual relationship looks like.
That's it.
Actual relationship looks like there's this boundary, whether it's with a parent or a friend or a partner, and we're going to work through that in a healthy way. And you're modeling to that client as well, and that patient, how they should be acting with their friends and their relationships when they get out as well, right? If you're saying, I don't want to use, and this person keeps giving you substances, you've kind of modeled to them how to hold a boundary and be consistent. You know, this is not what I need, and they can hold that boundary, right?
Oh, absolutely. And then one of the things in fact, we should talk about this next week, or next time we chat, rather, Nathan, is, practical steps, and sometimes there are, relationships that need a firmer boundary, as I say, if I always tell a story about once I was out with some friends, and one of my mates is in recovery, and this one guy we were out with kept on making a big thing about, when he got around, oh, you don't want it, do you, mate? Do you want it? And I was like, I think we all just sort of sat over and said, well, we don't need to hang out with this guy anymore because he's a prick. I think averting those sort of conversations, having that sort of, like, having that boundary in it is really tricky. And exactly what you say with me, Corey, a parent says no, but I love you. Can I have that icy pole on Sunday morning, Dad? Absolutely not. But I still love you very much.
And one thing I'll kind of just add on before we kind of finish, I think it's really important in that kind of therapeutic environment and those boundaries is to reflect on how we set up our relationships with the clients from the beginning, to have these clear expectations. Because then that sets up a conversation for us to have, because we spoke about this and now we have to have this conversation. And once again, that models to the client how to set up their own relationships out in the world as well. Um,
Big time.
yeah.
And holding that frame of that relationship throughout the whole relationship. You set it up at the start, but you can sometimes feel it chip away. Oh, this little small, I returned late from leave, or I needed it, and it's getting chipped away. And so when we make what we talk about in AA, seemingly irrelevant decisions, it's these little chipping away at the boundaries. And if we're not holding it throughout the whole time, of course, it's going to come as a shock and a betrayal at the end when I've done, when I've had a massive boundary violation that you're saying I have to leave, because I've pushed the boundary all the way through our relationship until now, and you've been fine with it. So I think it's really important to have that frame and hold to it.
Love that, Rich. Love that. Well done.
I love chatting to you, Nathan. It's been fantastic having you on. I'm sure I'll catch you again.
For sure. Catch you later.